the Old Testament of the Bible records. The covenant between God and Abraham, giving him and his descendants a piece of land as their homeland and kingdom. At that time Abraham could not have imagined that for the next thousands of years, his descendants would constantly fight and kill each other to claim ownership of this promised land. His son Ishmael is the ancestor of today's Arabs, while his other son Isaac's descendants are the Jews. These two nations revolve around the land called Palestine, previously known as Canaan, and between 1948 and 1982, they engaged in 5 major conflicts, known as the Middle East Wars. The origin of the Middle East conflict can be traced back 3,000 years. Let's continue the story from the Bible. Abraham had a son named Jacob. God tested Jacob by having an angel wrestle with him. In a test of strength, Jacob, even without divine power, managed to defeat the angel. As a result, God blessed him and renamed him Israel, meaning one who struggles with God. Israel had 12 sons, and these 12 families continued to grow and multiply, eventually forming the Jewish nation. This biblical story contains many fictional elements, but Jewish people who believe in Judaism wholeheartedly accept it. They consider themselves the descendants of Israel and see Jerusalem, in the heart of Palestine, as the land God promised to them. At the end of the 11th century BC, Jerusalem became the capital, and they established the Kingdom of Israel. Under the reign of Solomon, Israel reached its zenith, achieving great influence in commerce, military, and religion, making it one of the most powerful nations in the Middle East. However, this prosperity did not last. After Solomon's death, the Kingdom of Israel fell into division and decline. It was eventually conquered by the Assyrians and later, the Babylonians. The Jews lost their homeland, and they could not regain political power. Under the oppression of conquerors, most Jews left their homeland and began a 2,000-year exile. They dispersed across the world, settling in many countries. During this time, their sense of identity remained strong. They upheld their faith and rarely intermarried with other groups, which allowed them to endure as a distinct people. On the other hand, they placed a strong emphasis on education and trade. Despite their small population, they often managed to amass wealth and gain influence and status in many countries. Yet, their distinct identity and the prevailing anti-Semitism resulted in long-term persecution of Jews in Europe and the Middle East. With each persecution, Jews fled from one country to another, making them the people without a homeland. It's not that they didn't want to change this situation, they were just unable to do so. They couldn't establish a nation in any country or regain political power. During their long exile, Jews gradually realized that no country in the world could protect them indefinitely. To end their constant state of upheaval, they needed to establish their own nation. Returning to Jerusalem and reclaiming the Promised Land became an attractive idea. This notion eventually evolved into Jewish Zionism, which gained widespread popularity in the late 19th century. Influenced by this movement, many Jews from around the world began to return to Palestine. But Palestine was not vacant land. In the absence of Jews, the rise of Islam took place, and Arab people became the predominant ethnic group in the Middle East. They spread across the region and established many countries. Among them, Palestinians are the largest group in Palestine. As Jews came back after over 2,000 years of absence, they appeared more like immigrants. They purchased land from Arabs and established Jewish settlements, intending to settle there. As more Jewish immigrants arrived, these settlements expanded, leading to conflicts with Arab people and setting the stage for the later Middle East wars. In 1945, at the end of World War II, Nazi Germany killed millions of Jews, significantly increasing Jewish concerns. The idea of establishing a Jewish state became a consensus among Jews worldwide. The Zionist movement reached its peak in the late 19th century, and they began returning to Palestine on a large scale. By the end of World War II, there were already 600,000 Jewish residents in Palestine, constituting 1/3 of the total population. While Arab nations took offense at this influx, the British had to hand over the administration of the region to the United Nations, as they couldn't manage the situation. When an issue was placed on the United Nations agenda, it became an arena for big power struggles. Both the United States and the Soviet Union had similar interests in this matter, as they both wanted to create conflict and chaos in the Middle East, to prevent any single Arab nation from dominating the region. Simultaneously, they aimed to dismantle the traditional British colonial system in the Middle East. On November 29, 1947, with the tacit agreement of the United States and the Soviet Union, the United Nations General Assembly passed Resolution 181. This resolution divided Palestine into two parts, establishing a Jewish state called Israel and an Arab state called Palestine. Jews, who accounted for only 1/3 of the population, received 57% of the land, most of which had fertile soil and abundant freshwater resources. This decision was highly unfair and angered the Arab countries attending the meeting. Egypt, leading a group of 6 Arab countries, staged a collective walkout in protest. Palestine could not be established, but Jews readily accepted the resolution. On May 14, 1948, Israel declared its independence, and after more than 2,000 years of wandering, Jews once again established a country in the Promised Land that God had given to them. Israel celebrated with jubilation, but there were also concerns. They knew that Arab countries would not accept this easily, and Israel could be both created and destroyed in the following wars. The day after Israel's establishment, all neighboring countries, Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon, declared war on it, initiating the First Arab-Israeli War. In the early stages of the war, the Arab countries had a significant advantage in terms of troops and weapons. Israel, just newly founded, was initially on the defensive and continuously retreating. 3 days after the war began, Jordanian forces entered Jerusalem, and Israel's power seemed to wane. The Israeli leadership realized that, if the war continued in this manner, Israel could face destruction. They decided to defend with all their might while seeking international intervention. To buy time for diplomatic efforts, the Israeli troops, in dire straits, displayed astonishing combat capabilities. Facing an impending loss of Jerusalem and confronting Jordanian forces, they engaged in a fierce street battle for 10 days. In the north, confronting the Syrian army, Israeli militia faced armored forces with small arms. They even assembled an emergency howitzer from a 19th-century museum. This temporary resistance halted the enemy's advance. These efforts did not go in vain, and on May 29, the United Nations declared a ceasefire agreement, requiring both sides to cease hostilities for 4 weeks. The Arab countries, having the upper hand, made a crucial mistake at this point. They believed that, through their initial offensive, they had already destroyed Israel, and the ceasefire was just a formality. In these 4 weeks, they expected to gain more favorable terms by pushing forward and occupying more land. However, Israel had made effective use of the ceasefire period. It obtained weapons from Eastern Europe, recruited volunteers from Jewish organizations worldwide, and took in a massive wave of Jewish refugees. During this time, Israel transformed from a hastily assembled militia to a strong army of 65,000 people. When the ceasefire ended, Israel embarked on a counteroffensive. These decisive victories in this stage set the tone for future conflicts. During this time, Israel occupied more land than that designated by the United Nations and made Jerusalem its capital. The war officially ended in February 1949 with the signing of armistice agreements. The First Arab-Israeli War resulted in an Israel that was larger than expected and was able to consolidate its control over the territory. Moreover, the war was a disaster for the Arab states. They failed to defeat Israel and lost a considerable portion of Palestine. They had no choice but to sign an armistice agreement, which established the status quo of Israel's occupation. At the same time, a large number of Palestinian Arabs became refugees, as they were either expelled or fled the fighting. They ended up in refugee camps in neighboring Arab countries. and have since become a major issue in the Arab-Israeli conflict. While Israel survived and even thrived, the surrounding Arab states saw this conflict as a continuing challenge. They regarded the ceasefire as only a temporary measure and began preparing for the next round. The Second Arab-Israeli War broke out in 1956 when Israel, France, and Britain launched a surprise attack on Egypt in response to Egyptian President Nasser's nationalization of the Suez Canal. These three countries aimed to re-establish control over the canal and remove Nasser from power. However, they faced strong opposition from the United States and the Soviet Union, which forced them to withdraw and accept a ceasefire after several days of fighting. The war had little impact on the territorial borders of Israel. But further, the third and most significant conflict in the series was the Six-Day War in 1967. It began when Egypt, Syria, and Jordan mobilized their forces near Israel's borders. Israel, suspecting an imminent attack, launched a preemptive strike against the Egyptian and Syrian air forces, destroying them on the ground. This opening move gave Israel air superiority and initiated a Six-Day War, in which Israel captured the Gaza Strip and the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan, and the Golan Heights from Syria. This war significantly expanded Israel's territory and placed Jerusalem under its control. However, it also led to the displacement of more Palestinians, and their situation became increasingly dire. In the aftermath of the Six-Day War, Israel offered to trade land for peace with its Arab neighbors. This initiative was delivered through a proposal known as UN Security Council Resolution 242, calling for Israel to withdraw from the territories it had captured in exchange for Arab recognition of Israel's right to exist. While some Arab states agreed in principle to negotiate with Israel, the Palestinian territories, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights remained occupied, and the situation continued to be a major source of tension. The Yom Kippur War of 1973, also known as the October War, was the fourth large-scale conflict in this series. It began when Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel during the Jewish holiday of Yom Kippur. In the initial stages of the war, Arab forces achieved some successes, but Israel eventually managed to repel the attacks. The war ended with a ceasefire